Today's lesson is on Cowboys or the Move West. We just finished up talking about Reconstruction in class, which was the period after the Civil War. Okay, after the Civil War, we talked about how they were rebuilding different aspects of the United States, and one of the problems we had at that time was that not many people had land. So one way we could fix that was to move west. So we began this week by talking about Reconstruction. And although this was not totally successful, it did bring us the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The passage of these three amendments took our nation a step further into equal rights. After attempting to reconstruct the Union, Americans quickly shifted their focus to the frontier, or to the American West, in hopes of finding more land. Obviously, the Americans wouldn't be the first settlers west of the Mississippi. In the West, we could find multiple groups of Indians who called their homes the Great Plains. These would include the Iowa, the Osage, the Sioux, and the Cheyenne tribes. The Native American lifestyle was centered around the horse and the buffalo. The horse was brought to North America in 1598. And this new resource allowed the Native Americans to travel further in a shorter amount of time, and it aided in the ability to hunt. One of the main animals that they were hunting was the buffalo. Buffalo was used for food, but the hides were also used for making teepees, clothing, shoes, and blankets. Hunting buffalo makes mobility necessary because they would travel in herds and you need to follow them, like when we talked about the nomads at the beginning of this course. Mobility would be the ability to move around, and this often caused many problems because when they would follow the buffalo, the Native Americans, they would intrude on one another's territory. When we look at Native Americans, it is important to understand kind of their family life and how they lived at home. They had small extended family groups. Men were warriors and hunters, and women would butcher the animals and prepare the hides. Land was not seen as a possession by the Native Americans, but instead it was held in common for use for the whole tribe. Not just one person, they didn't own the land. This belief was obviously a lot different among the white settlers at this time. They believed that they had the right to own their own land. The way that the white settlers justified the removal of the Indians was because they said the Native Americans hadn't improved their land. Thus, they had forfeited their claim to it. So by saying that, they said that when the Indians were just roaming the land, they weren't actually improving it. The white settlers thought that they could improve this land by tilling and cultivating it and growing food. They really saw the Indians as wasteful. Besides the dream of owning land, many settlers came to the West with the hopes of finding silver and gold. Gold was first discovered in Colorado in 1858, and this really excited many people, especially the immigrants who had just entered the country from places like Ireland, Germany, Poland, and China. If we look back to 1834, we can see an act that had designated all of the Great Plains as a reservation for Native Americans. A reservation is a place set aside for the Native Americans to live. This act of 1834 was overturned in the 1850s because the government decided that they in fact wanted those lands. The Native Americans didn't obviously share the same opinion with the white people, and they crossed those imaginary borders that were set for them. The crossing of these imaginary borders caused clashing with other tribes and white settlers, and that leads us into a couple of bloody battles that we can look at between the Native Americans and the settlers. One of the first of these bloody battles that we can look at was the massacre at Sand Creek in 1864. The Cheyenne Indians at this time, in 1864, had peacefully returned to the Colorado Sand Creek Reserve for the winter. Unfortunately for them, General S.R. Curtis, a U.S. Army commander in the West, decided that he wanted to keep pursuing these Indians back to the Sand Creek Reserve, and he wanted the Indians to suffer some more. He gave Colonel John Chivingston and his troops orders to keep attacking the Indians. And on November 29, 1864, his troops killed over 150 Cheyenne Indians, most of which were women and children. Another battle that we could look at was the death on the Bozeman Trail. The Bozeman Trail was a trail that white settlers would follow in order to reach a gold mining destination. This trail cut through Sioux hunting grounds, and the Sioux were unhappy with that. Red Cloud, the Sioux chief, tried to talk with the U.S. government, but it didn't work. The Sioux under Crazy Horse attacked Captain William J. Fetterman and his company at Lodge Trail Ridge, killing over 80 soldiers. Fighting here continued until the signing of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, in which the Sioux agreed to live on a reservation along the Mississippi River. However, there was one Sioux leader named Sitting Bull who never signed this treaty. We will learn more about Sitting Bull here in a couple of minutes. Before that, we're going to look at another of the bloody battles called the Red River War. This was a result of the Kiowa and the Comanche tribes beginning a 6-year streak of raids against the white settlers. They were fed up at this time, and they wanted to push them back. The U.S. Army decided to take the friendly tribes onto reservations and the others as they started to shoot at them. The Union Army under General Philip Sheridan crushed the Native American resistance to the battle at the Red River War. A couple more famous battles we'll look at here, and one of them is Custer's Last Stand. The Native Americans were really in a tough spot because of the gold rush. General George A. Custer had told white settlers that the Black Hills were covered in gold. These were in South Dakota. This was another infringement on Sioux territory. The Sioux and the Cheyenne had a Sundance ritual in 1876, and Sitting Bull, who I talked about earlier, had visions of soldiers and Native Americans falling from the hills. The Native Americans saw this as a sign, and they waited for the settlers at the Bighorn River to come looking for gold. The Indians destroyed Custer and surprised them, and he killed all of his troops, including Custer. However, the white settlers were relentless in getting back at the Sioux Indians, and they drove them into Canada. Sitting Bull stayed in Canada until 1881, and then he surrendered in 1885, where he ended up being humiliated, and from then on he was always shown in William F. Cody, also known as Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where they kind of showed him off and made him look like a fool. Another popular Indian battle we can look at was the Battle of Wounded Knee. This took place on December 29, 1890, as the 7th Cavalry, which was one of Custer's old regiments, rounded up 350 starving and freezing Sioux Indians, taking them to a camp at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The soldiers demanded that the Sioux would surrender their weapons, but the Sioux refused. A random shot was fired, we don't know where from, and the soldiers wiped out 300 unarmed Native Americans. Many of them were children. So this whole time we were fighting against the Indians, we really wanted a thing called assimilation, which is defined as to absorb and to integrate. The government was in favor of assimilating or absorbing the Indians into the white settlers' culture, something that the Native Americans obviously didn't want. They were trying to Americanize the Native Americans, or bring them into white culture while expecting them to abandon their beliefs. Very strong beliefs at that. One thing we did to try to assimilate those Indians was the Dawes Act of 1887. The Dawes Act of 1887 broke up reservations that the Indians were already on, and it gave 160 acres of land to each head of the household. It gave 80 acres to each unmarried adult. The rest of the land would be sold to white settlers, and the government would use the revenue to get farm implements, which are farm tools, for the Native American settlers. As you can guess, the Native Americans never saw any of that income. So first of all, their land was taken from them, it was divided up, and then it was given back to them in small amounts. But this really seemed to them like it was owning land, and that was not their belief. They didn't think you should be able to own land. But that is what the Dawes Act of 87 did. And then they were supposed to get money from the selling of the extra land to white settlers. They never saw any of that land. The life of the Native Americans took another big hit with the destruction of the buffalo. With more settlers moving west, there was more hunting taking place. For instance, in 1800, there was approximately 65 million buffalo in the West. Fast forward to where we are now in 1890, there was fewer than 1,000 buffalo. This leads us up to cattle and cowboys. With the destruction of all the buffalo, ranching became a desirable investment. Mexicans taught the white settlers how to round up, how to rope, and how to care for the cattle that they were now going to work with. The longhorn was the primary cattle that was raised, and during the 1860s, there was a large demand for beef. So let's take a look at some of the cowboy terminology and see where it came from, because these cowboys were actually trained by Mexican cowboys, so our neighbors to the south. Vaquero is a Mexican cowboy that actually taught the white settlers. Chaparreras are leather overalls, and we often now call them chaps. Charqui is now jerky, and that is dried strips of meat. Bronco caballo, or rough horse, we now refer to as a bronc or a bronco. Mestinos is a Mustang, and then another one that we're used to is rancho or a ranch. So these are all cowboy terms that we can trace back to the Mexican heritage where we picked it up at. Life of a cowboy at this time was definitely not easy. They had very, very long days. One of the goals of a cowboy was they would drive their cattle to main rail lines in order to ship the cattle. Cattle drives were often long and difficult because of weather and large rivers. A newer and quicker trail was established to get the cattle to a desired destination, and that was the Chisholm Trail that extended from San Antonio, Texas to Abilene, Kansas, so the trail went through Oklahoma. Cowboys were extremely busy people. They worked 10 to 14-hour days, often sitting on a horse and driving cattle. 25% of the cowboys at this time were African American. In the spring, the cowboys would have a roundup where they would corral a bunch of longhorns, confine them to an area, and brand them. The transport of the longhorns was known as the long drive, and this sometimes lasted up to 3 months. The open range was profitable while it lasted, but it didn't last for that long. Overgrazing the land, extended bad weather, and the invention of barbed wire brought an end to the open range. Ranchers quickly turned to smaller herds of better cattle. Joseph F. Glidden was responsible for the invention of barbed wire, in which the ranchers could contain their cattle.